Every discussion of Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers film eventually ends up with some version of this exchange. The Federation isn't fascist. Yes, it is. Look at Doogie Himmler. And speaking solely of the film, not the book, it was intended as a satire of broadly defined fascism, both historical and as perceived in some aspects of America at the time. As director Paul Verhoeven states, basically, the political undercurrent of the film is that these heroes and heroines are living in a fascist utopia, but they are not even aware of it. They think this is normal, and somehow you are seduced to follow them, and at the same time made aware that they might be fascists. A similar intent is at the heart of the film's spiritual successor, Helldivers 2. Quoting Johan Pillestedt, CEO of the game's developer Arrowhead, "We asked ourselves, could we brainwash an entire community to fight for a fascist state? Would they? Would we be okay with that?" And turns out, yeah, actually. But they're not spoofing fascism. They're reflecting the already cartoonish post-World War II mythology of fascism. Distinctly different things. And in the world we live in now, that cultural mythologized fascism is far more important than the historical reality. We live primarily in a world made of stories, and that post-World War II mythos is one of the foundational stories of our time. Nazis, fascists, I'm going to use the terms pretty much interchangeably here. It's completely wrong historically and ideologically, but I'm talking about cultural impressions, where it's all kind of blended together. It's become a shorthand for evil, built around a militarist chic visual style far more than any real substance. The key to this bit of shorthand is that, unlike the Cold War trope of the evil commie, the Nazi-derived bad guys didn't have to be actual Nazis, limiting their use to World War II period stories. They just had to look kind of like Nazis, making it a universal shorthand defined almost entirely by visual style, a surface-level stylistic perception. Fascism is a hat. And it expands to the point that anything militaristic, sometimes even just hierarchical, becomes fascist. This has seeped out into our political discourse, with people being called fascists for anything from being actual neo-Nazis to simply wanting to prosecute crimes. It's become essentially meaningless, but we'll get to the dire consequences of that a bit later, fret not. For now, this applying of visual style to cartoonish villains is a thread that's woven through our culture since the war, going back at least as far as Chaplin's The Great Dictator, following through in a meandering line, always drifting further away from the historical and into the stylized, mythologized depiction until now, where Starship Troopers or Helldivers bear no more resemblance to actual historical or ideological fascism than Red Alert does to the Soviet Union.
До свидания. Bottoms up, Nikolai.
So let's look at that post-World War II mythology. The central pillar of it is that Nazi Germany was a singular evil, qualitatively different from anything else that came before or since, rather than merely an extreme manifestation of currents in the culture and politics of Europe at the time. This made it very easy to turn Hitler into a cartoonish placeholder, to separate the Nazis from the social conditions they existed within and why average people, whether middle class or working class, became Nazis. It pulls it out of time and transmutes motives and policy into nebulous evil. These regimes are imagined as bleak, universally oppressive murder machines, and for some people they were. But they also had wide public support. The Nazis actually did deliver on many of their promises with jobs and economic growth, even if a lot of it was built on shady financial shenanigans, MIFO bills and whatnot. And while there are a lot of factors involved with Italy's sharp reduction in the number of its citizens emigrating after the fascists came to power, it's notable that some Italians that had emigrated to America went back during Mussolini's rule. These generally weren't countries that had to put up walls and barbed wire to keep people in. I'm not saying that fascism was great, only that it wasn't fucking Mordor. People raised their kids, walked their dog, went out to dinner, hung out and laughed with their friends. These were overwhelmingly normal people, for the most part living what we would recognize as mostly normal lives. But that was not the cultural archetype that was needed during and even after the war. They had to be monsters, goblins and malicious sorcery updated to the modern age. And so it morphs into the jackbooted myrmidons of popular fiction, villains who will blow up entire planets on a whim. The Galactic Empire being the most famous iteration of the space Nazi trope, the one that's been the template for a half-century now. Stripped of the historical context and with its distinctive symbols sanitized in a way that invokes them without displaying them, it becomes both a storytelling shorthand and an easy image to project onto pretty much anything that one wants to vilify. The man in the high castle is notable here. After the series wrapped, all the swastikas were not simply thrown out or sent to the prop house, but carefully cut up and burned, almost like magical runes that needed to be ritually destroyed lest the power of the twisty spider get out and corrupt the world. As though just by existing they hurt people, exuding danger by the sigil alone. And that archetype of evil techno-wizardry changes with the times, evolving to stay relevant, but in the process, drifting further away from its roots, further into placeholder defined by style, not substance. And that allows it to be increasingly widely applied. Which brings me to Andor, and where I ask people to consider what I say before rage posting. It's a great show on its own merits, and it's superb Star Wars. I'm in no way knocking the series. I'm pointing out that it's also a prime example of this muddling of a once clear shorthand. Andor gives us two distinctly different kinds of space Nazi. We have the much more realistic and grounded characters, Dedra Meero and Cyril Karn most notably, as the regular people caught up in the system, gradually transformed into monsters through their service to the regime. But they coexist alongside the simpler space opera villain type, in this case Director Krennic, who owes more to Ming the Merciless than Albert Speer. He even wears a cape. But where Andor's take on the Imperials as stand-ins for fascism really gets interesting is the build-up to the Gorman massacre and how it lands in our current cultural and political landscape. For example, the No Kings protest this past summer, at time of recording, had a few people show up with Andor-inspired signs. I have friends everywhere, we are the Gore, etc. And yet, when I was watching the show, the protest on Gorman reminded me of nothing so much as the January 6th fiasco. Both depict a large group maneuvered into doing something stupid that serves the establishment narrative, and with contingency plans in place in case the crowd doesn't take the bait on cue. In Andor, the Imperial troops were sent out in a narrow cut-off line as both provocation and an easy target, but the crowd didn't attack, so they had a sniper take a shot into the crowd, triggering a riot. January 6th is strikingly similar, with people being led into position for maximum effect, and the apparent contingency plan of pipe bombs planted by someone yet to be identified if the crowd wasn't sufficiently energetic. Like the Gorman protest, everyone got played. The crowd out protesting, the citizens buying the official narrative of subversive or revolutionary activity, and the anti-establishment leaning people that defended, believing the whole thing was an organic protest that got out of hand rather than a carefully orchestrated spectacle that cost them more than they got from it. We are the Gore is not a slogan that I would self-apply. Also, don't LARP as genocide victims. That shit's really happening in the world, and playing victim for a few partisan political points is kind of gross. There's an even more direct comparison with the recent deployment of the National Guard to American cities. Americans as a people don't like soldiers patrolling the streets. We have a deep cultural aversion to it. It makes me a bit nervous looking at how it can be abused once normalized. But the use of military force is not, in and of itself, fascist. We can and should argue the differences between using them to deport illegal immigrants, to put down riots, or to, for example, integrate segregated schools. But these days, the knee-jerk reaction is to compare any military presence to stormtroopers because visually, stylistically, it all looks the same. It's an example of the post-war myth being distilled down and simplified to the point that it becomes meaningless. But we're also seeing the myth start to fade away. We're seeing it happen on multiple fronts. Academic study of World War II is just starting to critically examine the assumptions, understanding Germany as a belligerent power with objectives and limitations, run by people acting rationally within the context of their own goals and the information they had. More importantly, in the cultural and political space, the sting of old and overused labels is fading. A few decades ago, if someone was called an anti-Semite, it usually meant that they said something pretty out there. Today, it often just means they criticize the Israeli government. I and many of you watching this do that all the time. It's hard not to these days. And it's worth noting that the State of Israel is built largely on that post-war mythos, and we can see that it's fading generationally. Young people just aren't invested in the story. It doesn't shape their understanding of the world to anywhere near the degree that it does for older generations. That's probably going to have a huge impact on the amount of material support that America provides in the coming decades. The relationship is changing. Shifting to the West, the whole mass migration issue is an artifact of this as well. The idea that Britain, France, Germany, or even the United States have an obligation to take in anyone that wants in is rooted in this post-war story that holds that Nazis are the singular evil, the worst thing anyone can be. And because you can frame opposition to open mass migration in racial terms and Nazis were racist, you link the two and suddenly normal working class people who voice opposition to the influx are far right and to be shunned. Outside of that story, they're just normal, reasonable people that want obvious normal things. The universalist liberalism, diversity is always a net gain and populations can be shuffled around without ill effect belief, is sort of the mirror to that post-World War II mythos. But the story is breaking down. Just calling someone a Nazi, a fascist, a racist, has lost most of its power because it's been so overused. Just as it's difficult to effectively parody something when you can't articulate what it is in the first place, it's all superficial in trying to shame people with labels that have lost most of their impact. This isn't to say that there are no good parodies of fascism as it pertains to the world we live in. It's still very relevant, it just needs to be grounded more in its ideological context instead of just a catch-all, this is bad, with the implication that anything against it is good. Which may seem like an odd segue into Iron Sky, an absolutely bonkers Finnish film about an invasion by the moon Nazis.
They got this whole moon base, and they got this whole space thing going on, and they coming to take over.
For all its silliness, Iron Sky does a superb job not just of spoofing actual Nazis, but relating that ideology and its methods to our own world. The intro sequence with a black American astronaut on the moon, captured by Fritz hat-wearing moon troopers, frames contemporary American fixations on race and the Nazi master race ideas as equally goofy in their own ways.
Actually, how was sending those 2 astronauts to the moon supposed to get me re-elected? Exactly.
We haven't been to the moon for 50 years. One of them was black.
It's an ongoing theme, and coming from an outside perspective, it makes fun of American politics without getting too mired in partisan bullshit. While the president is a caricature of Sarah Palin, the film would work just as well with someone like AOC dropped into the role, and most of the jokes would still land, spoofing the absurdity of American politics across the board and the relentless need of those that have power to hold on to it, and the importance of image and crafting narratives to that end. As a takedown of propagandists is where it really works best. First is the thread with Vivian Wagner, the president's spin doctor. Her team of highly trained public relations specialists keep delivering the same soulless sludge as every other PR firm's team that learned the same things at the same schools. She needs something fresh, something vibrant, something with some verve and soul to it. Enter the moon Nazis, specifically Renata and Klaus. The end result? A spiffy ad campaign built on the same sanitized Nazism used as villain shorthand in so much of our media, but flipped around to make the style a positive, coupled with the kind of meaningless slogans and vacuous appeals to emotion that permeate American politics.
We are the people who carry the children on our shoulders, the same way that our fathers carried us, and their fathers carried them.
It's absurd, but that's the point. And Renata really believes what she's saying. It's not a trick that lets her be a conduit for the illusion of sincerity and the suggestion of policy. She eventually abandons that ideology when exposed to new information. We can even look at Renata as representative of younger people abandoning the worldviews, the story of their elders, just as the post-World War II mythos is dying now, rejecting old assumptions after a critical examination. But she represents the people in another way too. Klaus here is the establishment, specifically the entitled next generation of the status quo, eager to inherit power not so he can change things, but to use it to get more power. And just as he is courting Renata, so must the ruling class always court the favor of the people to some extent. The degree and methods can vary, but no rulers can simply do whatever they want, abuse their subordinates with impunity, without eventually facing the consequences, whether being voted out or Ceausescu. In this case, Renata, while duped, is the only one with any sincerity. Klaus, Vivian, the president, they're all saying what they think will get them what they want, not what they actually mean. It's a little on the nose as a political allegory, but hey.
You all gave me your word.
But you broke yours.
We always break ours, that's just what we do.
Yep, politics is just a game of lying convincingly. And if you can't fool enough of the people, all you have to do is drum up a good villain and go to war.
Who are these guys anyway?
Nazis. From the moon.
Real live Nazis. Holy shit, this just keeps getting better and better.
I'm not sure if Iron Sky works as satire of modern politics and Nazism because it's the first really post-Mythos take on it, or if it's just because Finland doesn't have quite the same hang-ups about that period as American culture has developed. But either way, it stands out as one of the rare cases that really work in that regard. As that post-war mythos fades, I wonder what comes next. In some ways, it's encouraging. I mean, we can look at the 20th century as a sort of trauma that we've never really gotten over. Culturally, there's a part of us that's been locked there ever since. We always compare foreign leaders we don't like to Hitler. We equate any expression of state power that doesn't align with our politics with fascism. But as that goes away, so will the framework of making assumptions about it. I'm not predicting so much as hypothesizing here. As the wake of the 20th century settles, I think we could see the world settle back into an essentially 19th century baseline of empires by other names with spheres of influence and a fading of that universalist liberalism that keeps tempo with the fading of the Nazi boogeyman. Expressing national and cultural identity amongst European peoples will cease to be taboo and become normal again. And I think we're going to see this transformation largely complete by the time the younger half of Gen Z is my age. And so I'm going to close with this one last bit of somewhat spicy analysis that's going to make some people angry, but hopefully also think. People are turning against open borders and mass migration, and if history is any guide, that turn is going to be an overcorrection. Because white guilt has been so heavily cultivated and exploited that it's starting to transmute into a return of European cultural and very possibly racial consciousness. Not in an ideological Nazi way, but rather a general sense of distinctiveness, a rejection of the universalist liberal idea that all people and cultures are essentially interchangeable. You can lump populations together and it'll be fine. And this is happening in part because pointing and shouting Nazi has been so abused that it doesn't work anymore. Almost nobody cares. The question I have is this, and don't take this too seriously. It's just a thought that crosses my mind when I see the apparent ineptitude of the political class around this particular issue. Is the backlash happening as a second-order effect from mass migration policies, which is to say, an unexpected result of incompetent policymakers not understanding that their policies would necessarily result in a backlash at least equal to the perceived damage those policies cause? Or is that the whole and entire point? Sometimes it feels like there's a cabal in the Swiss Alps somewhere, maybe with the Red Skull at the head of the table, meticulously burning away all that humanist universalism, slowly getting the people of the West to despise Africans and Middle Easterners enough that taking their resources and reducing global population pressures in one swoop won't upset the people of the developed world too much. Probably not. But whether the governing class is deviously evil or just staggeringly incompetent, they aren't going to have caricatures of Nazis to hide behind much longer. But sweeping aside all the big political issues for a while, I'm really curious what that's going to look like in science fiction in the decades going forward. Are we going to see a return to pre-World War II kind of tropes like Buck Rogers style, Yellow Peril kind of things, Ming the Merciless, Killer Kane, stuff like that? Or are we going to see something new? I suppose it's even possible that that end-stage post-World War II liberalism will end up getting the caricature villain treatment. That could be amusing. I've already been asked once why I'm using a cane now. Actually, it's a snake stick. You gotta poke around in the undergrowth.